just a couple more minutes for folks to roll in. A few announcements at least. My name is Eric Owens, and I'm Assistant Director of the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life this afternoon. I'd like to ask you, first of all, to turn off your cell phones and beepers, pagers, anything else that will buzz while we're talking today. And let you know that we are recording the event on video that we'll be streaming on our website within the next couple of days. So for those of you with friends and colleagues who weren't able to make it, or you want to come back to revisit some of the provocative themes of the session today, I encourage you to head back to our website, bc.edu/Boise, B-O-I-S-I. I'd also be remiss if I didn't announce a couple upcoming events. Two major events coming up in the next few weeks. First, next Tuesday, March 31st, Stephen Pope, a professor of theology here at Boston College, will be delivering a lecture on human evolution and Christian ethics. Cushing 001, 5 p.m. next. And then our final major panel of the year will be an author meets critics session with focusing on Alan Wolf's new book, The Future of Liberalism. His critics of the day will be Mary Bilder, law professor here at Boston College, and Daniel Mahoney, a conservative political theorist at Assumption College. That's Wednesday, April 29th, 4:30 to 6 p.m. in McGuinn Auditorium. I'm sure there'll be fireworks, and I look forward to seeing all of you there. We also have 3 upcoming lunch talks by your colleagues here at Boston College. Chemist Paul Davidovitz talking on scientific knowledge and faith next Wednesday at noon. Historian John Summers about the rehabilitation of the Gettysburg historical battlefield. And art historian Pamela Berger talking about ways of knowing through iconography, the Temple of Solomon and the Dome of the Rock. So all that is merely preface, of course, to the terrific event that we have here today, and thank you for being here. I'd like to take a moment to introduce Timothy Samuel Shah, our speaker for today. He's an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he focuses on religion and foreign policy. And he's a senior research scholar at the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs at Boston University. Prior to that, he was a senior fellow in Religion and World Affairs at the Pew Forum on Religion and American Public Life, one of the most prominent places to get information about the topics we're talking about today. Dr. Shah conducts research on religious movements and their impacts on global democratization, including evangelical Protestants in Africa and Latin America, Hindu nationalists in India, and Islamists in South Asia and the Middle East. He's worked on 2 books, one on religious nationalism in South Asia, where he's conducted extensive field research, and another co-authored with Monica Toth and Daniel Philpott on the importance of religion for the study of comparative politics and international relations. Since 1999, he has served as research director for an international study entitled Evangelical Protestantism and Democracy in the Global South, and has edited the resulting 4-volume series published by Oxford University Press in 2008-2009, 3 volumes of which are out now on the shelves and on the table outside if you'd like to acquire them for your own library. As Tim said in our meeting earlier today, they make terrific Easter gifts. He holds a bachelor's degree and a PhD in government and political science from Harvard University, and he studied law and theology at Christ Church, Oxford in the late 90s. He is at work on this terrifically interesting project that I think he'll talk about it with us today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Tim Shah.
Thank you very much, Eric Owens. Thank you very much, Alan Wolf. Thank you to the Boise Center. Thank you to Boston College for inviting me to talk about evangelicalism and democracy around the world and across time. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I should say right away that it's a particular pleasure because one of my colleagues who was part of the project, David Lumsdaine, is in the audience. David, I'll hold up one of the books again. David actually edited the volume on Asia and is with us, and I'm delighted and intimidated because he now will have to correct me when I talk about evangelicalism and democracy in Asia, but he'll no doubt enrich the discussion. Evangelical Christianity and politics have been much in the headlines, much in the news, much in our public discussion of late. And yet, it's undoubtedly the case that evangelical Christianity in the global South in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have not contributed much to the discussion because, in fact, we hear very little about evangelical politics in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And yet, I believe we should hear a lot more because there are something like 600 million evangelicals in those parts of the world. They constitute the vast majority of evangelicals in the world today. And they are, we argue in the series of volumes that I had the privilege to edit, they are having a major impact on the politics, the social dynamics of societies throughout the global South. So how can one possibly summarize all of these experiences? The volumes that I edited covered 16 countries, covered decades of evangelical political activism, covered innumerable evangelical political parties, politicians, churches, and so it's somewhat difficult and intimidating to try to think of a way at this vast topic in a very brief lecture. And I've made my job harder because I gave myself the title Evangelicals and Democracy Around the World and Across Time. The around the world part would be hard enough. The cross time part makes it even harder, especially since evangelicals have been around a long time. The historians tend to date the beginning of evangelicalism as a distinct movement to the 17th century or so, the mid-1600s. So evangelicals have been around a long time. Well, I do think, though, it's useful to have a broad synoptic focus that I've given myself, because only this kind of broad, comprehensive, synoptic focus will give us the context necessary for making sense of what I think have been evangelical political activism's enduring and characteristic features. There are some, I think, very striking characteristic and enduring features of evangelical political activism. Whether we're talking about evangelicalism in 19th century Britain, or 20th century America, or 21st century Zambia. And one can only really get at those enduring features if we have this sort of broad focus as I've given myself today. Well, so what can we say about evangelical political activism? And I want to say 5 things about evangelical political activism today and its relationship to democracy. One is that evangelicals are generally not very good at direct political activism and involvement, mainly because they're not very good idea builders and they're not very good institution builders. But of course, both are required for effective and sustained political activism. And I'm talking about the level of formal political activism. So that's one. Evangelicals are, in terms of formal political involvement, pretty incompetent, whether we're talking about the United States or the global South, and also whether we're talking about history as well. So that's number one. Number two is that direct political involvement and activism on the part of evangelicals has often not been very good for evangelical Christianity. Often evangelical Christianity has suffered in terms of reputation because of its political engagement and involvement. Evangelical political activism has fostered sharp and unnecessary divisions within evangelicalism, and it's undermined the moral authority of evangelicalism in broader society. I think that this is remarkably true, not just in the United States, but across many, many cases that we've examined. Number 3, evangelicalism is consistently very much at home with liberal democratic modernity. The cardinal principle of democratic modernity is the necessity and legitimacy of free choice. The cardinal principle of evangelical religion is the necessity and legitimacy of free choice in religion. One is not born a Christian. One cannot assume one is a Christian by virtue of one's family or upbringing. One must choose to be born again. There is therefore a deep and natural affinity between evangelicalism and modernity. And it's no accident that evangelicalism and modernity are historically speaking coextensive, beginning roughly in the 16th and 17th centuries in the social and intellectual maelstrom following the Protestant Reformation. Number 4, not only is evangelicalism sociologically at home with democratic modernity, but but evangelicalism has characteristically deepened and strengthened liberal democratic modernity. Not through its formal political involvement, which I said a minute ago has often been very ineffective, but above all by empowering otherwise marginalized individuals and groups and drawing them into full social and political participation. This is sometimes an indirect consequence of evangelical activism rather than a purposeful evangelical political project. Finally, number 5. A remarkable pattern, I think, is that evangelicalism across time and around the world has fairly consistently avoided involvement in theocratic political projects designed to impose some kind of comprehensive Christian legal or political system on society. Now, I want to just pause a moment and look back at these 5 points I've introduced, which I'll elaborate on now. I think each of these points is in some ways counter to what we tend to think about evangelicalism. Many people think that evangelicals are quasi-theocratic. Many people tend to think that evangelicals are not at home with liberal democratic modernity or anti-modern in some sense. Many people think that evangelicals are very, very good at political activism, that they're very powerful, very dangerous, very effective, that they have forged very effective and powerful political organizations, groups, parties, and so forth. I think all those things are false. Evangelicals are actually not very theocratic, they tend to be very pro-democratic, but also they're not very good at politics, and much of their political activism has backfired. They've experienced a tremendous amount of blowback from much of their political activism, their formal political activism around the world. So that's what I want to argue today, and I'll do that in the following steps. First, I'll talk briefly about definitional issues. Who exactly are evangelical Protestants? I'll talk a bit about demographic issues. How many evangelicals are there and where are they? I'll talk a bit about the respects in which evangelical politics, as I want to argue, have often proven ineffective and self-undermining. I'll talk a bit about the ways in which evangelicalism is at home with liberal democratic modernity. I'll talk about evangelicalism as a pro-democratic force, particularly as an agent of empowerment and inclusion. And then I'll talk about evangelicalism's characteristic aversion to theocratic political projects. First definition. Evangelicalism is not a church, it's not a denomination, it has no formal membership, it has no headquarters, it has no capital or sacred center, it doesn't have a Rome or a Mecca. Evangelicals have no pope, no authoritative magisterium. Evangelicalism is rather a trans-denominational Protestant movement whose defining characteristic is to insist that authentic Christianity requires more than formal ecclesial membership or adherence. Instead, authentic Christian faith demands a belief that the Bible enjoys an authority that trumps other sources of authority, such as reason or tradition, personal and inward acceptance of the gospel message that Christ has atoned for humanity's sins on the cross and has thereby won eternal salvation for believers, and outward mission and activism on the part of all believers, lay and clerical alike, to share the good news of salvation with others. So evangelicalism, to summarize, has 3 defining imperatives. 1 is believe in the authority of the Bible. 2, be born again by trusting in the salvific power of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. And 3, broadcast the good news of salvation in Christ with others. Believe in the Bible, be born again, and broadcast the good news. While no single imperative necessarily distinguishes evangelicals from numerous other Christians, the evangelical label can be meaningfully applied whenever Christians, almost always Protestants, embrace all these imperatives as a package, which historians believe probably began sometime in the course of the 17th century, though possibly earlier. Given the diffuse and polycentric character and the variety of evangelicalism, the variety of its forms, the variety of its expressions over more than 300 years, it's difficult to define the unchanging relationship between evangelicalism and democracy. But I do think there is a certain coherence that evangelicalism possesses, which derives from its conceptually parsimonious tendency to resist ecclesial formalism in exchange for an experiential biblicism that by its nature is simple and hence widely accessible and adaptable across time and space. George Whitefield declared in 1740, "It was best to preach the new birth and the power of godliness, and not to insist so much on the form, for people would never be brought to one mind as to that, nor did Jesus Christ ever intend it." So said the great evangelical Anglican George Whitefield. Both the power and the weakness of evangelicalism lie precisely in this parsimony and flexibility, which give it a tremendous ability to adapt to a wide variety of cultural contexts, but also a tremendous inability to think and act as a unified movement, or to construct a coherent tradition. So that's my definition of evangelical Protestantism. Demography. Where are evangelicals, and how many are there? Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, leading scholars and other observers, such as the very famous Indian historian and diplomat K.M. Panikkar, predicted something with almost breathtaking confidence and uniformity, and Panikkar was only one of the people who predicted this. They predicted that Christianity in Asia and Africa would collapse once the coercive pressures of Western colonialism were removed. As it happens, that didn't happen. Once Western colonialism was removed, Christianity in Asia and Africa not only did not collapse, but they arguably increased at an even faster rate. And particularly Protestantism saw a continuing expansion, not contraction, in the last decades of the 20th century. In fact, throughout the global South, Christianity's post-colonial growth was at least as dramatic as its colonial growth. Protestantism in particular has seen significant post-colonial growth across the global South, more than doubling from about 4% of the overall global South population in 1970 to about 10% by 2000. I should be clear that when I say global South, I mean Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America as one massive geographical block. So from 4% in 1970 to 10% by 2000, meaning that today approximately 1 out of 10 persons in the global South is an evangelical Protestant, which contrasts dramatically to the situation at the beginning of the 20th century, when less than 1% of the global South population was evangelical Protestant. It's interesting to compare that growth with, say, the Roman Catholic numbers. Roman Catholicism saw its overall share of the global South population increase by only a little more than 1 percentage point during the same 30-year period, from 13 to 14%. Islam also grew rather modestly, though from a higher base, 19% to 23%. But again, evangelicalism went from 4 to 10. As a result of this exponential growth, the Protestant proportion of the population in Asia was 10 times greater at the end of the 20th century than at the beginning, in Africa 13 times greater, and in Latin America 6 times greater. I think it's fair to say, though not sufficiently appreciated, that no other major religious group in the world came close to experiencing such a dramatic, sustained, and extensive demographic expansion across the global South as Protestantism during this period. And it's clear that the most important driver and beneficiary of Protestantism's demographic expansion has been evangelicalism, especially in recent years in Pentecostal forms. Within most of the global South's thriving mainland Protestant churches, evangelicalism is a dominant, if not the dominant, driving element. So in other words, we must be careful not to assume that evangelicalism is a denominational category. When I say evangelicalism, I'm not talking about churches that are called evangelical or call themselves evangelical. Evangelicalism, as the trans-denominational movement I was talking about, is found very often in what we call mainline Protestant churches, particularly in the global South. The Anglican, Methodist, Lutheran, and Presbyterian churches in Asia and Africa are overwhelmingly evangelical in their theology, in their tone, in their style, in their activism and evangelism. In the course of the 20th century, of course, while evangelicalism experienced great growth in the global South, it experienced dramatic decline in Britain and continental Europe, continuing strength in the U.S., and to a lesser extent Canada, so that we saw a tremendous shift with evangelicalism becoming less and less a northern phenomenon and more a southern phenomenon, so that today the global South is home to perhaps 600 million of the world's approximately 750 million evangelical Protestants, upwards of 75%, in other words, of all evangelical Protestants live in the global south. The average evangelical doesn't look like Billy Graham or Pat Robertson, as we talked about in Eric's class earlier today. The average evangelical today would look like probably a black Brazilian woman, or a Nigerian woman, or a Dalit Indian from South India. That's the average demographic profile of an evangelical today. Well, so having defined evangelicalism and having talked a little bit about the demographic contours of evangelicalism, I want to make my arguments about the political consequences of evangelicalism. And the first argument I want to make, again, is that evangelical political activism, as we found in our study, has consistently been remarkably self-undermining. It has consistently not only failed to bring the goals that evangelicals expected, but it has also caused a dramatic decline in the authority and the credibility of evangelicalism as a social movement. A number of studies suggest that Protestants in general and evangelicals in particular throughout Latin America and Africa used to have what my wife Rebecca Shah calls reputational capital, a reputation for probity and integrity that gave them disproportionate access to economic resources and social influence. Many observers of evangelicalism, like Emilio Willems in Latin America in the 1950s and 1960s, and other observers in Africa, have found that in general evangelicals had a very kind of Weberian reputation. That employers were more likely to hire evangelicals because of this reputation for probity, reputation for hard work, reputation for thrift. But evidence over the last few years, and the evidence that we amassed in our case study, suggests that in a number of countries, including Brazil, evangelicals' quote, success in politics has led to serious declines in their reputational capital. Evangelicals who have played the game of politics have proven no less subject than others to its characteristic dynamics and temptations, including the corporatist pursuit of narrow group interests over and against the common good and participation in corrupt patron-client relations. Precisely where evangelicals vigorously seek their fair share of the political pie, in other words, the almost inevitable result is that the political pie bites back, as political scientist Daniel Levine noted in one of our volumes. Evangelicals who seek to enhance their political recognition and influence by any means whatsoever soon see their integrity, reputation, and political influence suffer setback after setback. Brazil is a remarkably clear case of this. In Brazil, a disproportionately large number of Pentecostal Congress members were under investigation since early 2006 for a contract kickback scandal involving government payments for ambulances. Many of these were not re-elected to office in the October 2006 elections. At one point before the 2006 elections, evangelical congressmen in the Brazilian Congress were 10% of the entire Congress, but they suffer disproportionately in these investigations of this kickback scandal. It's also become clear to many observers that the highly personal nature of evangelical religion tends to make evangelicals overwhelmingly interested in the personal evangelical piety of politicians and would-be rulers, their personal story, their personal narrative of redemption, and relatively uninterested in any concept of political apprenticeship, of constructing a movement painstakingly through years of voter education, party development, and internal democracy. The difficulty is if you put so much stock in the personal story of a given evangelical politician, what happens when that evangelical politician turns out not to be perfect? And that has happened again and again in evangelical politics. It happened with Jorge Serrano, who was the first evangelical Protestant democratically elected president in any Latin American country. Later was involved in a number of scandals. It's been through a number of global South evangelical politicians, Kim Young-sam, Olusegun Obasanjo in Nigeria, so on and so forth. The evangelical tendency to focus on personal conversion and transformation is carried over into politics and becomes a focus on the personal narrative and the story of politicians that are admired Again, this is vulnerable to human nature. Not everybody turns out to be perfect, of course. Another respect in which evangelical politics has proven to be ineffective or self-undermining is in the formation of Protestant political parties. Latin America has seen the formation of some 20 evangelical Protestant political parties. One might interpret that as a mark of great success and a mark of evangelical influence. In fact, it's turned out to be the opposite. Almost none of these evangelical parties have commanded the wide support even of evangelicals. They have usually turned out to be opportunistic efforts to capitalize on a voting bloc that's presumed to be uniform, which almost never, in fact, turns out to be uniform. Well, so that is my first argument about the political activism of evangelicalism, that it has, the formal political activism has consistently, across many, many cases, and we could go on for much longer to talk just about this issue, but in many, many cases it's proven to be ineffective and self-undermining. So the idea that there is a powerful, influential evangelical behemoth taking over the global south by some brilliant mechanism through complex stratagems implemented over time could not be more false. Evangelical political efforts have been ham-handed, to say the least. But with respect to the other issues I wanted to talk about, first with respect to modernity, evangelicalism, in terms of its broader relationship with democratic modernity, has a very powerful affinity with democratic modernity. I wanted to begin here by looking first at the way evangelicals were interpreted by people that didn't like them, going back to early historical times. Sometimes you learn the most about people by talking to people who don't like them. One person who really didn't like evangelicals much was James VI of Scotland and first of England. Evangelicals were impudent, James thought, so impudent as to sit, quote, Jack Fellow-like with Christ at the Lord's table. They were not only far too greasy and too informal in their manner of worship, they were far too private and far too personal in their practice of their religion. Simon Shah comments on James's view, a church atomized into innumerable individual readers of Scripture, engaged in obsessive self-interrogation, or shut up with their own family in a hermetically sealed household of godly morality, was to James's way of thinking, and that of those ministers he specially favored, like George Abbott or Lancelot Andrews, entirely destructive of the unity of church and nation. Through his entire reign in both Scotland and England, James never swerved from his conviction that the combination of the royal supremacy and bishops was the strongest way to resist Rome. All this was incomprehensible to evangelicals, who saw the ecclesiastical conservatism of James as a compromise with papism that seemed to put the godly evangelicalism of Edward VI and the early English reformers on perpetual hold. That captures, I think, the respect in which the insistent individualism and voluntarism, so evident early on among evangelicals, really struck at the heart of the pervasive arrangements at the time that involved the Erastian linkage between church and state. There was, of course, no such thing as a voluntary church in this period in the early 17th century. Throughout the Protestant world, you had various kinds of arrangements in which churches were essentially spiritual departments of the government. James believed evangelicals were a threat to the idea that the church was a spiritual department of his rule. But it's clear from the beginning that even more conservative evangelicals were in fact a threat to the existing non-voluntaristic Erastian church-state arrangements. Lutheran Pietists were early pioneers of evangelicalism. The first Lutheran Pietists exhibited thoroughly evangelical tendencies, including an emphasis on the importance of personal conversion. In important respects, the very nature of Pietist teaching bore important implications for politics and the state. In 1675, the Lutheran pastor Philip Jakob Spener published a small book, Pia Desideria, or the heartfelt longing for a God-pleasing reform of the true evangelical church, which in many ways marked the formal beginning of European evangelicalism. In the wake of the increasing control continental European states imposed on churches in the aftermath of the 1648 Treaties of Westphalia, and in the context of a growing intellectualism in Lutheran theology, Spener advocated a fourfold program of church reform: intensive Bible study, both individual and in small group Bible studies essentially, greater emphasis on lay ministry, the active relating of Christian faith to daily life, and the evangelism of unbelievers through compassion and positive example rather than state coercion. This was an evangelical emphasis from the beginning. For our purposes here, in terms of the politics, Pietist discomfort with state coercion merits special emphasis. Now, Pietists, we shouldn't misunderstand, believed in working as much as possible within the structures of the state-established church, but they began to insist that true and saving religion belonged to an entirely voluntary sphere outside the state's capacity to control. While they did not deny that the state had a legitimate interest in encouraging true religion, they were far more skeptical than the reformers, whether Lutheran, Calvinist, or Anglican, of the power of the state to effect spiritual reformation. The outstanding scholar of early evangelicalism, W.R. Ward, writes, "What had always been understood by reform had been action from above by the state, and particularly the public disciplining of the irreligious. In contrast, early evangelicals like Spener held that the renewal of a sterile church establishment could only come from ordinary believers, from voluntary religion, meeting in groups that operated outside state sponsorship. From the beginning, in other words, evangelicalism distanced itself from what had been a broad reformed and indeed classical Christian doctrine that the state played a crucial role in the advancement of true religion." And these kinds of emphases one sees in other early evangelicals, Baptists like John Bunyan in England, Roger Williams, who was not formally a Baptist, but of course worked very closely with Baptists, and the early Methodists as well, all had this emphasis that true spiritual reform had to occur in a voluntary, individualistic context. So, and here I should say I've been influenced very much by a new article that Peter Berger is working on. So the contention here is that evangelical Protestantism has an additional and even deeper affinity with modernity than Protestantism in general. At the core of this form of Christianity, of evangelicalism, is its insistence that to be a Christian, one must go through a distinctive individual experience, that of being born again. In evangelical language, to accept Jesus Christ as one's own personal Lord and Savior. In other words, religious identity is established by an act of individual choice. This was a radical departure from the regimes of James and the other post-Reformation European rulers. It is this fact which singles out evangelical Protestantism as a peculiarly modern religion. Not surprisingly, it is widely perceived as such, especially in places where it is newly introduced, as we found in our research. Of course, specific choices are made in other religious communities as to the degree of observance in Judaism, as to entering a monastic order in Catholicism, and so forth. But in most of these cases, the individual choices are in an overall context of highly communal religion. But it is in evangelical Protestantism, perhaps uniquely, that an act of individual choice is at the very core of the religion. One cannot be born a Christian. One must be born again to merit that designation. The born-again experience legitimates the claim of equal human dignity by all who have gone through it. India has not on the whole been a very fertile field for Protestant growth. But as my wife is currently doing research on this topic, Protestantism has especially appealed to Dalits, formerly known as untouchables, the lowest and most despised group in the Hindu caste system. The following episode from a missionary report is very interesting. A Dalit entered a cloth store owned by an upper caste individual. The Dalit happened to put his hand on a bale of cloth, touched it. The enraged storekeeper shouted at the Dalit, "You are unclean. You have polluted my store. Get out." The Dalit replied, "No, I am not unclean. The Lord has made me clean." The institutional correlate of individual choices is a community constituted by these choices. that is the institutional correlate of individual choice in religion, is the church as a voluntary association. Not understood as an institution that has a proprietary relationship over an entire territory as an adherent, but the church as a voluntary association. As was argued above, modern plurality imposes this institutional form on all religious communities. Evangelical Protestantism does not need to have this institution imposed on it. The voluntary association is its natural social expression from its earliest foundations, from Spener onward. So that's my argument that evangelicalism has a special natural affinity with modernity. Now I want to talk a little bit about the pro-democratic consequences, particularly of contemporary evangelical Christianity. One striking finding from our research in 16 countries was that minority groups, ethnic minorities, including racial minorities, otherwise marginalized groups of lower socioeconomic status, all of these groups are well represented in third world evangelicalism, arguably disproportionately represented. And a consistent dynamic of evangelical activism is the fact that it includes so many more minorities, ethnic minorities, otherwise marginalized groups, means that evangelicalism is an effective channel for these groups to greater influence and political participation. Examples from Latin America include a black presidential candidate in Costa Rica, an evangelical Amerindian political party in Ecuador, and many black Pentecostal members of Congress in Brazil, who are otherwise actually rather rare. Brazil has also witnessed the spectacular political career of Benedict De Silva, the most well-known representative of Brazil's evangelical left, the largest in Latin America. She became a leftist Workers' Party activist and city councilor in Rio after joining the Assemblies of God. She was elected to the Constituent Assembly in 1986, and in 1994 became Brazil's first black woman senator. She is black, woman, Pentecostal. In Latin America, Protestantism, and especially Pentecostalism, is associated disproportionately with the poor, less educated, and darker skinned. This is also true of the founders of the major Pentecostal denominations, most of whom were proletarians, independent artisans, lower middle class, white-collar workers. Indeed, in many parts of the world, evangelicalism is disproportionately minority. More black than white in Brazil, more indigenous than mestizo in Mexico and Guatemala, more Dalit and Adivasi than upper caste in India, more Tamil than Sinhalese in Sri Lanka, more Chinese and Indian than Malay in Malaysia. So what does minority involvement in evangelicalism do politically for these minority and marginalized groups? For one thing, survey research conducted outside of our project by Timothy Steigenga in Guatemala and Costa Rica found that participation, just becoming evangelical, tends to increase the interest and desire to participate politically. Steigenga found that Pentecostals and charismatics were more likely to vote and engage in voluntary community work than religious liberals or the religiously unaffiliated. And there is considerable evidence from other quarters of spillover effects, where skills learned from religious activism are transferred to social and political militancy. And I want to just emphasize here how interestingly this relates to the work on the United States of Sidney Verba, Kay Schlossman, and Henry Brady on voluntarism and political participation in the United States. They, of course, argue that the predominant political effect of social institutions in general is to reinforce the resource advantages of privileged groups in society. Generally speaking, even voluntary organizations, your Lions Club, your Kiwanis Club, your generic voluntary organization, reinforces the unequal distribution of political resources in the United States. Social capital and civil society in and of themselves do not make political participation more equitable. There's only one exception to this. Only religious institutions provide a counterbalance to this cumulative resource process. They play an unusual role in the American political system by providing opportunities for those who would otherwise be resource poor. Churches therefore play a unique role in building the civic skills of many of those least likely to participate in politics, as Verba et al. Explain, even when church activists pursue endeavors with no demonstrable political content, they have opportunities to develop skills that are relevant for politics. These skill-endowing opportunities can serve a compensatory function, enhancing political resources among church activists whose educational and occupational levels might otherwise predispose them to political quiescence. Participation in church activity is an important corrective, therefore, to the uneven benefits of education and income. And this helps to explain why African Americans have greater participation rates than one would otherwise expect, given their socioeconomic resources. In other words, church participation has a disproportionately positive impact on minority political participation. We believe in study after study that a comparable dynamic is going on in dozens of global South countries, where the participation by underrepresented, marginalized, lower status groups in many third world societies is being counterbalanced by some extent, because these groups are disproportionately being empowered by global South evangelicalism. For example, a striking 2002 survey in Rio de Janeiro demonstrated that Pentecostal women, despite being poorer than average, were more interested in voting in elections than women of any other religion, as well as women without religion. In our case studies of Mexico, we noted the empowering impact of evangelicalism on women. A female primary school teacher from an evangelical church reported, "In the church, I learned how to treat adolescent rebelliousness," something that teachers need to know how to do, "to be responsible in my commitments, to lose the fear of speaking in public, to lead a service, to make an outline." Such examples of evangelical women in rural and indigenous congregations, Vasquez comments, are typical of how these women manage to experience independence and power in a world full of ethnic, cultural, and sexist discrimination. And one could multiply the examples many times over. Another aspect of this is not just the education of otherwise marginalized groups in civic skills, but also the empowering of individuals for participation in the public sphere, to use Jürgen Habermas's concept. Vasquez's study of evangelicals in Mexico in our volume tells us that evangelicals learn to structure coherent and convincing ideas and to communicate directly with individuals and with larger groups, as well as to participate in discussions with other people in the defense and dissemination of their faith. As Paul Freston, one of our volume editors, commented, Vasquez reminds us that evangelical voluntarism and the evangelical insistence on the right and duty to propagate the faith, to convince, and to publicize, bears more than a resemblance to Jürgen Habermas's concept of the public sphere and communicative action. Freston continues, the massive daily practice of grassroots persuasion inherent in evangelical proselytization, something that some of us otherwise find distasteful, may be vital for the quality of democracy and a robust public sphere. Indeed, in the global South of today, religious controversies spurred by evangelical missionary and evangelistic efforts have an observable tendency to intensify public debate of otherwise closed issues such as religious conversion, the bounds of religious freedom, the relationship between religion, national identity, and territory, and thus foster a more vigorous, more pluralistic, and more democratic public sphere. This has occurred and is occurring in India, Sri Lanka, China, southern Mexico, northern Nigeria, and numerous other countries. Finally, my last point is that evangelicals have not only been supportive of democracy, but there's also a great deal of evidence that they have not engaged in the kind of theocratic practices that are a threat to democracy. In part, this is due to the political incompetence of evangelicals. I suppose if evangelicals were more organized, more effective, they would be perhaps able to organize some kind of theocratic conspiracy. But evangelicals generally have failed to produce any detailed political program, a consistent political style, a unified political front. In part, this is because of various theological divisions within evangelicalism. In part, it's because of ethnic and racial tribal divisions within evangelicalism in other parts of the world. But despite all these differences, some observers worry that there is a robust theocratic agenda in evangelicalism, one that originated perhaps in the dominion theology of theonomic reconstructionism, developed by American American theologians R.J. Rushdoony and Gary North. Others think that the real danger isn't theocracy, but a kind of political quiescence, that evangelicals, because of a kind of quiescence, habitual quiescence, will be dupes, will be used by interested parties in some other political project. Well, it's interesting, first of all, to note that both these observations can't both be true. At least they can't be true of the same group of evangelicals at the same time, for the obvious reason that one can't both be indifferent to the state and intent on capturing it. The reality, in fact, as we found in our studies, is that evangelical political activists, whether in the global north or the global south, don't generally look much like Islamist militants with theocratic projects, nor do they look much like Amish separatists, quiescent. They fall somewhere in the middle. They fall into very mainstream patterns of political involvement. A few evangelicals, like theonomic reconstructionists, as well as some neo-Pentecostal political activists in Guatemala and Zambia, believe it is their evangelical right and duty to capture the state, to implement a top-down, biblically mandated reform and cleansing of society. And surveys show that some Pentecostal evangelicals support constitutional amendments to make their countries officially Christian. Much interestingly, as America's National Association of Evangelicals supported constitutional amendments in the United States for many years, up through the 1960s, I believe, declaring the United States government under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Of course, that was never passed. Frederick Chiluba, the openly evangelical president of Zambia from 1991 to 2002, declared the country Christian in a private ceremony in December 1991, and he forced legislation through Parliament in 1996, officially altering the preamble to the Constitution to designate the Republic of Zambia a Christian nation. So that would seem to suggest there is some theocratic tendency. But these apparently theocratic tendencies, in fact, have not had much influence in the global south. In fact, nowhere in the world has a theocratic agenda ever mobilized a significant number of evangelicals, let alone unified them into a common political front over any sustained period of time. The truth is that Chiluba, the one example that's often presented, ended up dividing rather than unifying Zambia's evangelical community and left office deeply unpopular. In several surveys, samples of Pentecostals, who probably constitute the world's most intense subgroup of evangelicals, consistently embrace church-state separation over Christian nationalism. Only in 3 countries, according to a Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life survey that I was involved in, only 3 countries, Nigeria, South Africa, and the U.S., only in those countries do majorities or pluralities of Pentecostal surveyed express support for the idea that the state should make their country a Christian nation. And even in those countries, the percentages are very low, or relatively low, at 58%, 45%, and 52%, respectively. Consistent with this limited evangelical support for theocratic politics in even a mild form, neither the political field nor the religious landscape in most countries, including the U.S., has favored candidates or movements perceived as practicing Christian identity politics or promoting a specifically evangelical political agenda. From Pat Robertson in 1988 to Mike Huckabee in 2008, presidential candidates emerging from the evangelical movement in the U.S. and making their evangelical identity a central element in their campaigns have consistently fallen far short of attracting monolithic evangelical support. I won't bore you with the numbers, but it was clear even throughout the recent Republican presidential campaign that Huckabee enjoyed only slightly more white evangelical support than McCain, even after he won the Iowa caucus. The pattern is very similar outside the U.S. Evangelical politicians who try to run on largely evangelical platforms, like Rios Montt in Guatemala, Nevers Mumba in Zambia, Jerry Gana in Nigeria, have seldom performed well, and usually performed very badly in fair electoral contests. So, in conclusion, for evangelicals, freedom is an essential ingredient of spiritual and social redemption. Freedom is redeeming, as I say in my title, which makes evangelicalism a perhaps uniquely modern religion. But left to itself, according to evangelicals, freedom is also in need of redemption. Freedom needs to be redeemed. The weak need to be empowered to grasp and utilize the freedom God wants them to have, and the strong need to be reformed so that they do not abuse the freedom God has given them. Freedom is not bad, but it must be continually redeemed. It's an essential feature of true religion, but at the same time it must be continually redeemed. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Your Excellency. I neglected to mention that we have a second special feature of our event today, that our very own Alan Wolf has agreed to kick off our discussion with a few short reflections. I will skip a long introduction on Alan's behalf. He's well known to most of you. But I will say that in addition to being the director of the Boissier Center and a professor of political science here at Boston College, he's the author of an increasing number of works on international affairs and ethics, as well as a very provocative essay in last year's Atlantic Monthly in March about the return or rise or continuing strength of secularism in world politics. And we may hear a bit about that now. So, Alan.
Well, that was just a fabulous talk. I'm sure you all agree. Really, really fascinating, and just covered so much material and raised so many counterintuitive questions, as we said. We're just thrilled. Thank you so much for doing that. And really, I just wanted to raise some questions really at the margins. I actually don't object to most of your main presentations, and I think in my own way I've been trying to say many of the same things about evangelicals in American politics, in particular. In my book, The Transformation of American Religion, I sort of warn against the theocratic, the notion that so many people on the left have, or so many secular humanists have, that the rise of the Christian right inevitably will result in a theocratic takeover in the United States. And I make many of the same points that you do. But still, for the sake of discussion, at least a couple of questions. First, I think one of the, as we all know, one of the most extraordinarily influential books and articles that we have dealing with religion and politics globally is Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. And I just wonder how, in your analysis, evangelicals would fit into that argument. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that if we're having some kind of clash or war of civilizations, evangelicals, as you've described them, really can't be part of it. They're not well organized enough, in a sense, to become a political religion. Whenever they approach politics, it's like Icarus approaching the sun. Something terrible happens when they get too close to politics. So how could they organize themselves in such a way to really be part of that clash? Or if there were a clash of civilizations, wouldn't they, in a sense, want to opt out of it? You might see that, you mentioned the pietistic movements, for example, probably the most extreme version of that. Peace churches, which really do grow out of an evangelical background. Recently spoke at Messiah College in Pennsylvania, which is very strongly in the Anabaptist Mennonite Peace Church tradition. I mean, they would just want to opt out completely of any kind of war. But certainly a global or civilizational war, or a cosmic war, call it whatever you want. I mean, that would sound, if that's true, that would sound like a really positive contribution that the rise of evangelicalism globally might make, in that it just doesn't want to be part of any kind of emerging possibility of a global war featuring one religion fighting against another. On the other hand, this idea of a political religion has another side to it, and I wondered if you could say something about that. We see this in the arguments, particularly of people who write about political Islam, and in particular the two indistinguishable French writers, Gilles Capel and Olivier Bois, who both of whom, I always get, which one's making which argument, but both of them essentially say that while political Islam, begins with in this kind of Armageddon type, fight against all the Salafist and extreme violent jihadist sensibility, both of those writers are famous for emphasizing how over time the politics essentially moderates the religion. That, you know, you see this most significantly in Turkey with the AKP party, which it starts out, you know, as a militant Islamic party, but then because of the responsibilities that politics imposes upon it and governance imposes upon it, it becomes ultimately, it loses its Islamist character and becomes much more. And, you know, the same thing, Algeria, a number of countries where militant, Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, once a terrorist organization, is now kind of legal but closely watched by the Egyptian government. So, you know, politics can have either, I mean, your talk emphasized how apolitical so many evangelicals are, but politics can have either side to it. It can either lead to warfare, or it can lead to this moderation. In a sense, evangelicals might be out of that, either of those dynamics, because of its emphasis on personal rather than political transformation. I wondered also, a second sort of, you talked about how evangelicals are growing worldwide, but evangelicalism is a religion that's based upon enthusiasm. It substitutes enthusiasm for organization, as opposed to Catholicism, which substitutes organization for enthusiasm, right? So, you know, you get this intense, enthusiastic sensibility that substitutes for the lack of you know, a power structure or anything that would have institutional legs. But enthusiasm inevitably burns itself out. So while no one would question that it's growing, there must be limits to that growth in some way. And evangelical, especially, I mean, my field is much more the United States, but what always strikes me about evangelicalism in the United States, you know, is that economists talk about cyclical and secular trends. Secular not in the religious sense, but, you know, secular meaning long term and cyclical meaning like this. And evangelicalism always seems to go through these cyclical patterns, so that if you look at it at any one particular time, you see this great growth. But if you look at it over a much longer time, it's actually much flatter, because you are looking at a period of intense enthusiasm. You mentioned, you know, Max Weber, and everyone talks about the passage in Protestant Ethic where he goes and analyzes the sermon of John Wesley, an evangelical one, and the founder of Methodism, about how, you know, Methodism gives, evangelicalism gives people this this sense of empowerment that you talked about, but then they become wealthier, they become more complacent, and they lose the enthusiasm. And so I wonder if we won't witness something like that globally. In other words, that the very fervor that makes evangelicalism so attractive could contribute to a similar kind of dynamic that would make it less, that would automatically reduce its growth rates. And of course, speaking of growth rates, one has to point out that Islam and Catholicism start from much higher numbers. So any proportional gains that evangelicals, or proportional higher growth rates that evangelicals have, has to be tempered down somewhat, because it's beginning with such a lower base. I only have questions about the following topic because I don't know anything about it, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about two specific countries, China and Korea. Are they in the South, for one thing? Is Korea in the South? I mean, I wasn't sure about that. I know that in this country, so when people talk about the growth of evangelicalism in this country, and in particular when you read article after article about prestigious college campuses being now evangelicalized, it's almost all students from Korea and China. It's not students from Atlanta and Charlotte or Baylor or anything like that. And what's that about? Is there any, you know, could you say anything about that? I mean, I wonder whether or not in the third world, the South, evangelicalism is, whether the nature of since it's always a minority, whether the nature of the dominant religion influences where it will go stronger and so on. And so Korea and China strike me as having, you know, so different than Latin America in terms of the dominant religion that I wonder if there's anything to be explored with that. Now, my last comment is about your conclusion about democracy. Again, all the research that I'm familiar with strongly supports what you're saying. Of course, it's because I'm in the same department with Dave Schlossman, who co-authored the article you talked about. But yes, evangelicalism does really contribute to empowerment. When you look not at Kay's work, which is quantitative, but you look at the qualitative, the ethnographic work about evangelicalism, that theme of empowerment, communication, and so on, it really dominates. The political scientist who's will be most well known for this when his book comes out next year is John Shields, he's got his PhD at the University of Virginia, and Princeton University Press is publishing his book. He looks at very strong conservative Christians and their political activism in the U.S. and concludes that they really enhance democracy because they bring, just as you were saying, all these skills about organizing, communication, the Habermas point and all of that. But I just wonder if that's really what we want to talk about when we talk about democracy. That, in other words, you seem to be saying that democracy is participation, but there can be undemocratic forms of participation. So higher rates of participation could actually be undemocratic. There's a long tradition in political philosophy that emphasizes that the democratic virtues are not communicative skills or even participatory skills, but tolerance, respect for others, and so on. And I wonder about whether those skills are being taught. Shields' work, for example, persuades me, and it's not fair to mention this because you don't know it, but his work persuades me that conservative Christianity really does promote activism, but there's no evidence that it promotes tolerance. And that especially in multi-religious states, tolerance would be an enormously important democratic virtue. And how could, if we believe that Jesus is the one, the true, the only Savior, and come into my life, that just doesn't strike me as a particularly good recipe for promoting tolerance, especially with non-Christians that you may be sharing the same kind of society. So, is there any evidence about evangelicals and their ability to work in cross-religious coalitions, to work together with others to pursue goals, or is it much more that they're activated to pursue their own kinds of goals? Anyway, those are just some comments, but it was a wonderful talk, and we're just so delighted to have her. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wolf. Well, I'll start with the last point that you made, and I can't provide an adequate response to all of these comments and questions, some of which I have not thought deeply about at all. I may call on my colleague David Lumsden in the audience, who I know has thought about Asia in particular, given that he edited our Asia volume and lived in South Korea for many years. In terms of the last point that you raised, what kind of participation are evangelicals promoting? Are they able to promote tolerance and acceptance of people of other faiths, and is their exclusive theology incompatible with that sort of political tolerance? I think you can certainly find cases where a very confrontational evangelicalism has helped to sow political conflict. I think there have been some instances where Pentecostal and evangelical groups, individuals have helped to intensify conflict in northern Nigeria, for example. There have been some Pentecostal evangelical missionary efforts in parts of northern Nigeria that are very provocative. Statements have been made by Christian leaders at some points that have been very provocative. So there's no question about it that evangelicalism can sometimes promote a very intolerant, a very hostile attitude towards the religious other, which actually makes me think of your mentioning of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. There's some evidence that evangelicals don't want to opt out of the Clash of Civilizations. One of the things that we found in our studies is that one factor that often has provoked evangelical involvement is the perception or the reality of a threatening Islamic community in the same country. That's true in the Philippines, it's true in Nigeria, it's been true in Kenya. In many cases, an often hostile perception of Islam has generated evangelical political activism. Not more than other groups necessarily, but I think you can find a lot of evidence to support the idea that evangelicals do have a very strong perception of Islam as a serious threat, as something that has to be engaged in a very robust manner. But just, if I may for a moment digress on that, at the same time there's a lot of survey evidence that suggests that global evangelicals have not necessarily supported very aggressive American foreign policy with respect to Islam, which suggests a more nuanced view of what is the best way to engage the challenge of Islam. Survey evidence on evangelicals in Latin America, for example, shows that Latin American evangelicals are just as negative about American foreign policy, just as negative about the war on terror, just as negative about the Iraq war as Latin Americans in general. That's true of many Asian evangelicals. It's true of some African evangelicals as well. Surveys show that Nigerian evangelicals tend to be very, very hostile to Islam and more supportive of American foreign policy. In fact, I think George W. Bush was probably more popular among Christians in Nigeria than he was among Americans for a certain period in the second half of his second administration. But that doesn't necessarily mean that just to take Nigeria, that Nigerian evangelicals can't also engage in constructive cooperative efforts with Muslims. And one striking example of this that I'm personally aware of is that the Christian Association of Nigeria, which involves a lot of evangelical churches and was often headed by an evangelical, is now involved in a very robust interfaith cooperative enterprise with the Sultan of Sokoto, who's the most prestigious Muslim leader in Nigeria. And in fact, the Sultan of Sokoto has a very close personal friendship with the head of the Anglican Church in Nigeria, Peter Akinola, who is a quite outspoken evangelical Anglican, who in public statements can say very confrontational things about Islam, but at the same time has this very close personal relationship with the Sultan of Sokoto and is involved in an interfaith effort to quell violence when there's a threat of religious riots and so forth. So my sense is that many evangelicals can maintain a very exclusive theology, a very exclusive conception of the path to salvation, while at the same time engaging in robust cooperative efforts that could fall under what Robert Putnam referred to as bridging social capital. In fact, this was a striking finding of our study. It's found in the Asia volume quite a lot, actually, that you have many instances of evangelicals working with Buddhists in China. Evangelicals and Buddhists work closely together in some parts of China to bring about greater religious freedom at the district level. You have many other examples of evangelicals working with others. In fact, I didn't really say this clearly enough. I think it's clear that the preponderant way in which evangelicals engage in formal politics is not through specifically evangelical institutions or evangelical parties or evangelical coalitions, but by working with non-evangelicals, much as they do in the United States. Of course, our system doesn't encourage the formation of third parties, but evangelicals have formed, arguably, all kinds of surprising connections and arguably sort of some counterintuitive alliances between people who are not evangelicals on any number of issues. It's certainly not written in stone that evangelicals should ideologically have a lot in common with people who support gun ownership and free market economics and so forth, but somehow they've managed to form, for better and for worse, alliances with a variety of groups for political purposes. In a sense, that's the standard evangelical mode of operating in formal politics. Indian evangelicals cooperate with members of the left of center Congress Party, which is not surprising given the state of Indian politics and the threat of the Hindu nationalist movement. But it really is striking that in ways that are especially surprising to us, who see these issues through the prism of the Christian right, that there is actually a very large evangelical left in the global south. There's a very small evangelical left in the United States, which has some prominent spokespeople, but doesn't really seem to have a lot of heft demographically or institutionally. But there's a very large evangelical left in Brazil, for example. The large evangelical Pentecostal Church, the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, has forged a very close alliance with President Lula and the Workers' Party, and has supported Lula in the last couple of elections. So there is a surprising degree of diversity and a surprising fluidity in the kinds of coalitions evangelicals are willing to forge. There was a time when Pentecostals in Brazil demonized Lula as an atheist and anti-God politician, but I think actually partly because of the dynamics we were talking about, partly through the participation, just the participation in politics that they experienced, they began to get along with Lula and left-wing politicians that they had formerly demonized. I do agree with you, Professor Wolf, about the cyclical quality of evangelical growth. On the one hand, one wants to be impressed by the amount of growth that's occurred in global evangelicalism, but on the other hand, it's already apparent that in some countries there is a leveling off, if not a decline, in evangelical growth. In Guatemala, there was a very steep increase from a low base from the 1970s after the major earthquake in the mid-70s in Guatemala, huge steep increase, but there seems to be a plateauing of evangelical growth in Guatemala now. In South Korea as well, I think the evidence suggests a plateauing, if not even a slight decrease, of the overall Christian population as well as the Protestant population of South Korea. It seems that South Korean evangelicalism, to respond to your point about South Korea, has not been able to retain the adherence of its young people very well. There seems to be a major generational divide in South Korea with respect to attitudes towards the United States, with respect to attitudes towards the political establishment, with respect to attitudes towards the church. So that may be one reason why you've seen a leveling off in places like South Korea. And I think you could argue that something like the kind of the cyclical character of this that John Wesley bemoaned when he lamented the fact that his people were no longer ardent Methodists, is going on in some places. That evangelicalism at one stage of the development of a community or a family is functional, but then evangelicals either cease to be religious at all, or they gravitate to some other form of religion. I think that's certainly happening in some parts of the global south. So I would, if I may, I would like to call on my colleague David Lumsden to respond, if you'd like, to any of these questions.
Well, certainly we did tend to see in the studies in the Asia volume a lot of bridging capital. Tim's mentioned some of them, evangelical pastors working with other religious groups in Indonesia, in civic forums to quell violence, as you say, cooperation in China, a fair amount, I would even say a fair amount in parts of India, cooperation with Catholics, cooperation with Gandhians, and others in social amelioration. I guess if it comes to the question Professor Wolf was raising about is there something in the nature, the intellectual content of evangelical faith which makes cooperation difficult with other groups? One could tackle that in two ways. One could tackle that by asking, well, what does one make of the intellectual, the inherent reasons that one might suppose would cause or not cause such conflict. So you gave some kinds of answers, but one can find opposite arguments at that theoretical level also. So let's say evangelicals are very prone to regard themselves as merely sinners saved by grace, and therefore to be in some way tolerant of others who perhaps are off the right path, but may later come to the right path, and so on. So one, at that kind of abstract level, one could make arguments either way. I think one also has to be a little careful about finding or over-interpreting instances of conflict. So let's take northern Nigeria. Well, is some friction there? Does that reflect a sort of a hostile or uncooperative attitude on the part of evangelicals, or is it a kind of tit-for-tat strategy faced with a fairly aggressive imposition of Sharia law, not only on Muslims but also on Christians in northern Nigerian states? So it seems to me that there's some empirical basis for doubting that. Since you asked about China and Korea, I mean, I think it's one of the things that kept occurring to me as a question while I was in Korea is that Korean is clearly the most Confucian society in Asia, and had sort of the clearest strongest evangelical presence. Koreans now send about as many missionaries out of their quarter of the population of 44 million as Americans do out of their 60 million. So and one wonders if some of that might be occurring also in China. Lots of the Chinese Christians, who are mostly evangelicals, are very evangelistic. Let's say the Back to Jerusalem movement and so on. So why is that? I mean, possibly some of that could have to do with the emphasis in Confucian culture and in evangelicalism on the structure of the family. In my view, that's not directly a political question. I also would like to just emphasize just a bit more what Tim did emphasize already, that there are a lot of different ways in what we found in which evangelical religion emphasizes a variety of different characteristics that are useful to democracy, including skills of working together. People who have not been working together come together in little churches and cooperate in doing little church projects, and in that way learn to cooperate with others in making larger networks and so on. And there are other kinds of ways in which sort of civic virtue is promoted. So those are some thoughts that I have.
We can open it up now for any other questions.
I had a question about the role of literacy.
Yes.
Thinking of things like the Wycliffe translators.
Yes.
Stainer's first point was Bible studies.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there a big link between that and the empowerment question? And a second one has to do with one of my friends who has been a journalist very close to the whole movement of political theology or liberation theology in Latin America, has talked about, in a certain sense, the demise of Catholic comunidades de base, and also then the fact that certain Latin American countries rate much higher in terms of economic honesty and so forth and so on, and success, than one would imagine. And Costa Rica, one you mentioned several times, is one of the very highest. And so I'm wondering how about the question of becoming empowered and then becoming successful. It is that linked to also appreciating other forms of worship and so forth, and perhaps moving across to other kinds of more liturgically rich churches, and things like that? Those are my two.
First, literacy. Yes, there is a lot of historical and contemporary evidence that evangelical evangelical conversion are associated with increased literacy. Historically speaking, the sociologist Robert Woodbury at the University of Texas has argued that historically speaking, those districts, going down as deep as the district level, those districts of the global south that had a higher density of Protestant missionary activity have higher literacy rates, even to this day. I mean, he's done very complex kinds of analyses which show this, and the conclusion from that would be that areas of the world which had more Protestant missionary activity had more schools. Generally speaking, Protestant missionaries established schools and efforts to educate people. In fact, this has been very important in Sri Lanka. Part of why the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka achieved disproportionately higher education rates, much to the chagrin of the Sinhalese, is because American missionaries concentrated their educational efforts in northern Sri Lanka, where the Tamils are. And as a consequence, Tamils became much more literate and accomplished in mathematics, science fields, and this actually helped to contribute to the Civil War, which happened much later, inadvertently, of course. So yes, there is definitely a connection between Protestantism, evangelicalism, and literacy, and you see it in the ethnographic accounts of evangelical conversion. The converts talk about their interest in reading the Bible. They're becoming more interested, therefore, in thinking and reading and discussing. Also, so literacy in a broader sense is enhanced by, in a sense, being plunged into a kind of discursively energetic community where people are thinking, reading, talking, debating, arguing theology, and so forth. So that's something that one finds again and again in ethnographic accounts of evangelicalism today. In terms of economic development, I'm not sure I understood your question. You were asking whether.
It was a little bit spurred by Alan's question about the cyclical.
Right.
That longitudinally, there's a way in which empowerment would also probably mean becoming more economic, having your status raised
Right.
overall,
Right.
and then being able to live and imagine a richer kind of life. And would that involve also changing not becoming not Christian, but
Right.
changing one's church allegiance to more liturgically
Right.
rich churches and so forth?
Right, I see, yes. In global South evangelicalism, I mean, yes, the answer is yes. You have seen that. I do think that one has to be cautious in that there has been less evidence about a macroeconomic effect. Some people have claimed that over time, if you have enough evangelical converts in a society, that this will have a visible macroeconomic effect. I think the jury is still out on that. You certainly have microeconomic consequences on individuals and families, which can be observed over time, though they're also not easy to document because many of these studies that claim to show microeconomic effects on individuals and families don't begin with a clear baseline. So it's hard to know where people started. They may claim that they experienced something. It's clear that some kinds of microeconomic empowerment are going on. How much of an impact it's having is a little more difficult to grasp. In terms of what happens to evangelicals in terms of their choice of church, one thing about global South evangelicalism is that it's extremely protean. It's not that people necessarily will join a liturgical church, but that evangelicalism itself keeps producing new churches and new forms and styles at such a rapid pace. I mean, the hot new Pentecostal churches were the charismatic, kind of neo-charismatic churches, but those are now 15 to 20 years old. You now have new churches that are kind of a new version of evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, and charismatic